Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through my sermon, the status that it is right now, Friday afternoon. Last week, I talked about the end of transactional religion. We started reading the book of Ezra. Now, transactional religion I describe as this. I give you what I think or what you told me you want in exchange for what you're giving me, or what I told you, or what you think that I want. In other words, it's a transaction. And when this gets into spirituality, I give God or the gods or the universe, or I participate in karma one way or another, and this is how I'm able to get what I want. There are some ideas out there that are fairly nakedly transactional, such as the law of attraction, where if you want good things, you're supposed to do good things, or you're supposed to think good things, and that's to attract good things to you. And if you look at various kinds of popular spiritualities today, you'll find all sorts of this stuff, and lots of people on the internet who will tell you exactly how to get it. Now, instrumental appropriation of others is, not necessarily a bad thing. I have lots of instrumental relationships in my life. When I go to Bel Air to buy my food, I give them money, they give me food. It's a pretty straightforward transaction. You have that with almost any retailers. You have that, as I mentioned last week, you have that in cooperative groups often. Everyone should be pulling their share, as we say. Now, when it comes to human beings, though, for the most part, we want to be loved and not used. This type of relationship gets problematic when it comes to the most important relationships of our lives. Often we have a very low tolerance for kissing up, and we have a much higher tolerance for kicking down, especially if we're doing the kicking. One of my favorite Korean dramas called Secret Garden has an element of the storyline where the young protagonist, he's the grandson of a very wealthy man, and everyone in the family is always vying for the grandfather's favor because they want to stay in his will. And it basically makes all of their relationships transactional. Now, the grandfather probably likes manipulating everyone. Everyone below resents it. But the truth is that this isn't a relationship that should be happening in families. Almost everyone in the family kisses up to the wealthy grandfather so that the fortune will keep flowing down to them and enabling their lifestyle. Well, what does the grandfather want? Well, hopefully he'll be less petty about all sorts of things he's looking at, and probably want to have more of a relationship with his children and grandchildren that goes beyond just the amount of money that he has. Now, when it comes to spirituality, there are really two main options today. There's secularism or deism, where there is no God, or God doesn't hear or care. There are no levers in the universe, and so supernatural behaviors looking to achieve religious behaviors or spiritual behaviors looking to achieve supernatural interventions are simply written off as superstitious. Maybe this is just foolish games, stupid human tricks that we play. Now, common religion, spirituality, often will have a dynamic where you kiss up to God or the universe, or you're involved in karma, or you might, or the God might kick down on you. Now, the God of the Bible. Does God relate to human beings as individuals? Well, he certainly seems to be doing that through much of the Bible. Is God available for relationship? Well, that seems to be the implication of his relating to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and that's, Jesus says again and again, invites crowds to address God as Father. Does God relate transactionally? That's a much tougher question when you read the Bible, because there are many, many passages where God looks pretty transactional. The Old Testament covenant God looks pretty transactional. And we're going to look we're going to read the book of Haggai today, which is one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. And some of these portions just look nakedly transactional. If God does operate transactional, can we use him to get what we want out of life? I should edit that slide. It's not clear for me. If God does work transactionally, I still can't. I still don't have that sentence right. Oh, man. Third time. If God does work transactionally, can we use him to get what we want out of life? Is this offensive to God? Does God have feelings about this? What if the persons you are trying to work... what am I saying here? What if the persons you are trying to work to get what you want are smarter, have more information, and have lived forever and seen everything? You know, this is kind of the 2-year-old test. If you've ever watched a 2-year-old manipulate a parent, the parent who's manipulated by the 2-year-old has real problems. The good parent understands that the parent is the adult and the 2-year-old is 2, and sees far beyond it, and will see through the manipulation that the 2-year-old is putting on them. Now, obviously, any God who would make a universe like this should be smart enough, have lived long enough, has way more information, and so our little attempts to manipulate God, well, God would obviously see through them. So does God relate transactionally? See, my basic, one of the things that, this is, I don't know if I'll say this in the sermon, but there's systematic theology and there's biblical theology. And one of the things that you do is you look at your basic frame that you look at, and you do use that frame to interpret individual Bible passages. And pretty much by definition, I come to the Bible and say, God of the universe probably won't be able to be suckered by me. And that's because if the God of the universe can be fooled by me, then we're all in a lot more trouble than is worth me getting away with something. Now, last week we looked at Ezra 1 through 3, and one of the things that you'll often notice if you study the Bible is that you get different perspectives from different books of the Bible. So if you look at the book of Ezra, a lot of history is sort of compressed into a flat space. If you look at the timeline, even the timelines, these are all given in Ezra and in Haggai. The exile started returning to Jerusalem about 538 BC. 530. Zerubbabel brings a group back in 538. Sheshbazzar brings a group back in 537. 536, Cyrus makes his proclamation. So it seems, people right away started heading back there. But again, as we talked about last week, it's just a small group. Jews continue to live throughout the ancient world in far greater numbers than they repopulate the promised land. Now, the temple doesn't get finished until 516. Haggai starts in 520. And so what we're looking at is pretty much 18 years between return and things really getting going on the temple. And it's going to take at least 4 years for them to really work on it and fix it. Now we're up to King Darius, where this is actually 2 kings after Cyrus, and so we're looking at 18 years here. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house, which is part of what they came down there to do. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it the time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much but harvested little. You eat but never have enough. You drink but never have your fill. You put on clothes but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in the purse with holes in it. What's he saying here? He's basically saying you haven't flourished because you haven't owned up to your religious obligations. Now, this is a very powerful point that pastors like to use, and not saying it's an illegitimate point, but I think it's helpful to recognize what kind of point it is, because I could very easily take this message from a prophet, transport it right now into this realm and say, well, if you would give more money at church, then your life would be better. And that could very well be the case. But I don't count myself a prophet of the Lord that's going to tell you that specifically in this context, even though this is a trick that pastors usually like to use. And I'm not saying it's illegitimate, but I think it's important that we look at all the layers to this. But God is making a pretty transactional argument with his people there. And it continues. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expect much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crop. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, on the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, on all the labors of your hand. Now, again, this looks pretty transactional. And, every time there's a natural disaster, it seems Pat Robertson would blame some group or another. But it's always as if they're, it's not like the world is lacking in sinners of just about every variety, and natural disasters seem to follow certain patterns. And so it always raises these questions. Is God involved in these things? Well, right here, secularism starts in a certain way and says God isn't involved in those things. Oh, okay. Do you know that? Pat Robertson says he is. Does he know that? It would seem to me one might take a skeptical position on both assertions and say, well, maybe you don't know. Certainly, if you believe in God, a God who controls the world, a God who's interactional, a God who cares, certainly possible that God might do this. So you can't rule it out. Many times you can't rule it in. Billy Joel says only the good die young. Is that true? Now in my Jordan Peterson stuff, I get into this God number one and God number two. And one of the things that I think Jordan Peterson was emphasizing is that this word God involves all this stuff. And that's built into the Bible. You often have sort of the divine passive. If something happens, it gets attributed to God. And we're not really at all sure what to do with a lot of that stuff. Secularism sort of wipes it away. Religiosity sort of indulges it. But the truth is, what we don't know, we don't know. But the Bible very much shows God as being the God of general revelation and the Lord of nature. All these impersonal systems God can act through. But also God number two, a God who hears, a God who listens, a God who responds, a God who expresses will, not just causal mechanisms. And I know that a lot of people will not like the ambiguity or the tension between these positions, but the Bible's comfortable to live in that tension. We'd rather resolve it one way or another and push it to the side. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. See, I usually read these things in my head, and you just kind of skip over them. You never learned how to pronounce them. Jozadak, that's better. And the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent them, and the people feared the Lord. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means they're paying attention to him. They're in awe of him. They're not neglecting him or acting like God isn't there, or God doesn't care, or God doesn't listen. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you. Well, that's good to hear, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the Spirit. And I love this passage because here we get a sense of what Spirit is. The Lord stirred up the Spirit. In other words, God's moving. God moves through Haggai. God moves through Zerubbabel. God moves through Joshua. And the Spirit of the whole remnant of the people. And again, we like, in a secular society, we like pulling back from this kind of thing, but this is actually really the best language you can use for it. Sometimes things happen and Spirit moves, and we're not sure how or why or what God is doing, or if there's God or other spirits or what, but this is exactly the appropriate use of the language. The Spirit moved the people, because sometimes these movements go through, and the Bible usually represents that as, well, that's Spirit. It's this thing that is moving things. We don't explain it. We don't know where it comes from. Think of John 3, verse 8. But God's Spirit moves through the people. And they came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God, in the 24th day of the 6th month of the 2nd year of King Darius. But then there's some more stuff in this book that's really interesting if you're thinking along these lines. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. This is God large and in charge. I will shake all the nations. We don't like being shaked usually, and nations don't like being shaked. And what is desired by all the nations will come. And I will fill this house with glory. Wow, that's exactly what they're looking for. They're looking for the promises of the old kingdom to be realized, that Jerusalem would be the center of the world and the people of the world would be gathered to her. The silver and the gold, the silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. Abraham Kuyper says not, every square inch. Includes the silver and the gold. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty, and in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. Did this come true for the second temple? The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of foreign nations. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fail, each by the sword of his brother. This is chaos. He's going to bring chaos. On that day, declares the Lord. This is day of the Lord. If you've listened to past sermons, you've heard me talk about the day of the Lord. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. And we would imagine people here in Haggai thinking, oh, wow, good thing we're working on this temple. Once we get this temple built, boy, things are going to be great. Is that going to happen? Did that happen? Did Zerubbabel somehow become Zerubbabel the Great, greater than Cyrus the Great, or Darius the Great, or Julius Caesar? And did it all come to pass? Or did Zerubbabel become the governor of a sort of holding its own little group of people in a backwater that for most of the world they just didn't pay any attention to because they weren't important. They were only important to sort of their own people, most of whom didn't even bother moving back there. And then he gets into dietary laws. On the 24th day of the 9th month and the 2nd day of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priests what the law says. If someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? Well, no. Anybody who knows anything about how Old Testament dietary laws and clean and unclean, we know that, something consecrated touching something common or unconsecrated, that doesn't make it consecrated. It all goes the other way. We'll find that out in a minute. Then Haggai said, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? Shh, this is Sunday school questions. Yes, the priest replied, it becomes defiled. Everybody knows that. Then Haggai said, so it is with the people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer is defiled. Oh my. No wonder they don't have any crops. No wonder everything's bad. No wonder their transactionality doesn't really work well. Now give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. When anyone came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone came to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew, and hail, yet you did not return to me. In other words, there's transactional issues on both sides. Things going bad doesn't necessarily make people religious. In fact, I see that all the time. It's often when people walk away from God or walk away from the church, it's because bad stuff happens. And they say, Well, I can't believe in a God who would let this bad stuff happen, so nuts to him. Or, I've been going to church all my life and these things haven't turned around yet, so I'm not going back. Okay. Hear God saying, yeah, there you go. This is how it's been. From this day on, from the 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. It'll take 4 years. Is there yet any seed in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree and the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. Now, we don't have the farm report from after the 24th day of the 9th month of the 2nd year of King Darius. Did it get better? Might have. One of the interesting things about these books is that these men were considered prophets. And usually men were considered prophets if their prophecies came to be. And so it's not unreasonable to rule out some sort of fulfillment which energized the people collecting these books and writing down these prophecies to include Haggai in the Bible. But did that temple that they built accomplish this? Well, we just answered the Sunday school questions. If something that is consecrated touches something that is not consecrated, the consecrated doesn't make the unconsecrated consecrated. It doesn't work that way. But if something is common or even consecrated and it gets touched by something unclean, well, then everything becomes unclean. In other words, this prophecy is saying that the temple is going to undo this. But the thing is, we've never seen anything like this in the Old Testament. We've never really seen, we've seen the power of something corrupt or unclean to make something consecrated unclean, but we've never seen something that had the power to make something clean. What could do that? Well, let's zip over to Matthew 8. There's 3 little stories in the Gospel of Matthew right after the Sermon on the Mount. I discovered this in seminary when I was working on this, and I thought the order of these passages is strangely important. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. That's after the Sermon on the Mount. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, make me clean." He's defiled. He's unclean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. "I am willing. Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Is Jesus the temple? What kind of temple is Jesus? Jesus is doing something that the temple never did. Here's a diagram of the temple. This is Herod's temple. What Herod did was take the temple that Zerubbabel started building and gave it a whole bunch of upgrades and made it look a lot better and added gold because Herod wanted to be considered a Messiah. Where would the lepers be? They can't even enter the city. They can't get anywhere close to the temple. Jesus touches the leper, and he says, notice what he says. He doesn't just say, have good health, don't have leprosy anymore. He says, be clean. Next story is the faith of the centurion. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said, "Shall I come to him?" Now, for Jesus to go into the house of a centurion would make Jesus unclean. The centurion's been living around these people long enough to understand their customs, and he's coming in asking for a favor. The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such faith." This is a Gentile. "I say to you, I say to you that many will come from east and west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, that doesn't sound very transactional. And Jesus said to the centurion, Go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Now the leper couldn't even enter Jerusalem. You see, way over here in the corner, Gentiles' court, centurion could go there. The centurion has faith. Why is this story after the story of the leper? Here, after the Sermon on the Mount, the order of these stories, we're making our way into the temple, and Jesus is, in a way, coming down from the mountain. Temples are on mountains, like the temple. Jesus is the temple. And he's coming to the temple. And healing and consecration is going out from the temple. Jesus is replacing the temple. When Jesus came to Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand. Someone else that's unclean. And the fever left her. And she got up and began to wait on him. Notice this area right up. You can't see it. I point out to the sermon. The women's court. Jesus is moving in towards the temple. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him. Remember the story in Mark when I did the sermon about Jesus and what he did? Here he does it again. Many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. Now it's interesting because it sounds like the infirmities and diseases just sort of go away, but Isaiah says he takes them up and he bears them. Now Jesus is the true Zerubbabel, seed of Babylon. He's the signet ring, the temple whose glory surpasses that of old, the earthquake that brings the nations. This is Christ and him crucified, bearing our sins, bearing our diseases. He does what Zerubbabel's temple cannot do. Now, back to the initial question, the question we all came with. Does Jesus see your need? Yes. Before you were born, he addressed it. I should put that in or I'll forget. Can you manipulate God? No. You're not that smart. You don't have enough power. You don't have that much power. You're too weak. You're too dumb. Don't try it. You can't manipulate God. It's offensive. What has he provided? One greater than the temple. One who was crucified, rose, and ascended. One who is here now. One who will raise you. That's what he's provided.